cultural orientations are required for all U.S. Marines, civilian employees, spouses, and dependents as young as 9 years old upon arrival at bases in Japan. In Okinawa, incoming personnel for all facilities are trained collectively in sessions offered weekly that include a lecture called Okinawa Cultural Awareness Training, or OCAT. Marines and their dependents cannot obtain a driver's license or leave base for personal or recreational purposes until they have completed this training, so participation is strictly enforced. But what is being taught in these courses? What kind of information does the United States Marine Corps want its newcomers to know about Okinawan and Japanese culture? On May 25, 2016, the Japan Times journalist John Mitchell, a 2015 awardee of the an awardee of the 2015 Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan's Freedom of the Press Award, published OCAT materials he had obtained via Freedom of Information Act request. Mitchell released 2 sets of slides used in the training sessions, one dated 2014 and one that appears to have been edited in both 2012 and 2016. These slides represent just one example of the materials produced by the U.S. military to prepare Marines and their families for life in Japan and Okinawa. Other welcome texts include websites, YouTube videos, base guidebooks, and even base lifestyle magazines, all of which are publicly available online. By examining the content of the OCAT trainings and these other welcome texts, I will offer a preliminary exploration of how the military frames Okinawan and Japanese culture for newcomers. This provides a window into the largely unexplored question of what it means to learn about a foreign culture through a militarily mediated lens, and what implications that learning could have for the relations between U.S. bases and their host communities in Okinawa and Japan. In his article on the OCAT slides, Mitchell draws particular attention to the phrase Gaijin power, which is used in the section about military crimes against Okinawans and Japanese. The slideshow introduces the term as an explanation for Marine crimes and misbehaviors, which are said to fuel Okinawa's anti-base movement. The idea behind Gaijin power is that Japanese and Okinawans are meant to have a very high tolerance for foreigners' bad behaviors, either out of a desire to avoid confrontation or a willingness to write off faux pas as signs of ignorance rather than ill intent. This tolerance, the story goes, leads to temptation, as foreigners find themselves getting away with more and more until they finally go too far. To exercise Gaijin power, then, is to take advantage of one's special entitlements and intentionally break rules because one is secure in the knowledge that there will be no repercussions. This phenomenon, more popularly known as Gaijin smash, is also found among American civilians and other Western foreigners in Japan. My focus today, however, is on what it means that the U.S. Marines have employed this term to explain military crime to newcomers. I argue that this is part of a larger pattern in which, deliberately or otherwise, the United States Marine Corps communicates narratives of American and Marine entitlement to incoming personnel and their families. Through a close reading of the OCAT lectures and other publicly available base newcomer resources, the welcome texts, I will explore one way in which the military attempts to frame how incoming troops and their families understand and experience Japan. This military-mediated vision of Japan, though couched in an attempt to improve relations with the host society, is nevertheless designed first and foremost to support the comfort and productivity of American defense personnel. The 2014 OCAT lecture frames Gaijin power as a sudden sensation of celebrity that overpowers a Marine's better judgment. By labeling it Gaijin power, the message is not that they will be respected for their military status, but that they will receive special treatment as foreigners, which locates the source of the problem not with the specialness of the Marines, but rather with the host culture. Additionally, by bringing the word into newcomers' orientations, they ensure that everyone arriving is equipped with the word and its implications from the beginning of their own experience. OCAT does not identify any specific examples of Gaijin power-inspired behavior, but Yana Tulos offers an illustrative civilian example in which her informant, an adult foreigner, intentionally bought a child's fair train ticket under the assumption that station staff would either be too nervous to confront her or would readily forgive her transgression because of her foreignness. The feeling of Gaijin power thus comes with an implicit belief in a weakness or passivity inherent to Okinawans and Japanese. This idea of cultural inferiority comes through clearly in the 2014 OCAT script, which states that Marines behave poorly because, quote, "We tend to think nobody is watching us, at least no one that we look up to." The OCAT then goes on to further implicate the local culture by situating abuses of Gaijin power within a Japanese and Okinawan culture of excessive drinking and pleasure quarters, and thus creating the space to shift at least partial responsibility onto a problematic host society. The OCAT is able to maintain the sense of moral superiority that is central to being a Marine, with descriptions of Marines as being, quote, "held to a higher standard," and representing, quote, "some of the best Americans the nation has to offer," coming in the paragraph immediately following the discussion of Gaijin power. This sense of both reinforcing the inferiority of the host culture and protecting the exceptionality of the Marines can be found throughout the welcome texts. These texts feature a mix of information about both life on base and the local culture, often including sections on public holidays, etiquette, local history, and nearby festivals and tourist attractions. The difference between these texts and civilian travel guides is in their stated purpose. Mainland welcome pamphlets describe the importance of cultural assimilation, while the Okinawan welcome video stresses, quote, "experiencing the gracious hospitality and friendship of the Okinawan people." Though most of the 2014 OCAT is printed in black, the text switches to an emphatic red when describing the role of understanding Okinawans', quote, "worldview, identity, norms, and narratives," as a means to, quote, "better manage the alliance." Thus, the official position of the Marines appears to be that understanding local culture is necessary to complete one's assignment in Okinawa and Japan successfully. However, the actual contents of the welcome texts tell a different story, one of exotic travel and comfortable lives abroad. The most obvious way that they do so is by not including Okinawan and Japanese people. One welcome pamphlet, for example, is over 80 pages long, with full-color photos on every other page, and still contains only 7 photos of Japanese people, and only 3 in which their faces are visible. The vast majority of photographs depict the base as a kind of Anytown USA, and those photographs that do highlight local culture generally show it being consumed by Marines, such as Caucasian men buying samurai swords. Zooming in on Japanese objects, zooming out until humans are barely discernible, cropping out the street level of buildings, and shooting landscapes when no people are present are all ways that these texts regularly present cultural images without people. In this way, Okinawa and Japan appear as empty backdrops to be explored, populated, and perhaps claimed by the American viewer. In fact, in those few cases where Japanese are present, as I said, their faces are seldom visible. One text features a full-page photo of a group of young Japanese dressed in vibrant kimono walking under cherry blossoms. However, they're walking away from the camera, so none of their faces are visible. 8 pages later, we find an American family dressed up in colorful summer kimono, smiling faces in full view, suggesting a lived experience rather than a scenic backdrop. Faceless figures were common throughout the texts that I examined. For example, the 2014 OCAT slide includes a photograph that shows the face of a uniformed Marine beating a taiko drum, while the Japanese drummers next to him have their heads turned away. In fact, aside from photographs of Okinawan politicians and Japanese prime ministers who are famously involved in the base debate, the slideshow features only one photograph with Okinawan people's faces clearly visible, while it much more prominently displays a picture of a white woman in a kimono in a later slide. Throughout all of my welcome texts, the vast majority of Japanese faces belong to waiters and entertainers, people offering services to the Marines. Erasures can be found in the written content as well. The 2014 OCAT, for example, offers roughly 100 words to summarize the entire history of Okinawa prior to 1944, and references but does not explain such key terms as the Satsuma clan or the Meiji Restoration, but then devotes 4 times as many words to America's role in Okinawan history from 1944 to 1950 alone. This is significant because the first stated objective of the slideshow is to, quote, learn key points about the history of Okinawa and its relationship with Japan and the United States. Framed in such a way, the lecture suggests that the key points of Okinawa's history all center on America. By thus foregrounding the US and local history and showing local culture as a novelty for American consumption rather than a space occupied by local people, the texts create a privileged position for the United States. Furthermore, the absence of Japanese and Okinawan people turns exercises of Gaijin power into victimless crimes, or at least establishes the Marines themselves as the only moral authority capable of judging such conduct. Consider the following passage found in every Iwakuni base welcome guide since at least 2013. Quote, "Conduct that is adverse to good order and discipline discredits the United States and negatively affects Iwakuni's mission." By locating this statement in the section on Japanese law, the author appears to be talking about crimes against Japanese people, since in other cases military law would apply. Yet the very idea that such crimes would have victims is excluded by the guide's unilateral focus on the consequences of misconduct for America's military agenda in Asia. This sentiment is echoed in the 2014 OCAT script, which discusses crime and accidents only within the context of negatively affecting the reputation of the United States and its military, and contributing to, quote, "connect the dot syndrome," a term which both describes and disparages the idea that Okinawans view military crimes as part of a historical trend rather than as isolated incidents. I would like to turn now to instances in which Japanese and Okinawans actually do appear in welcome texts. So all of these are excerpts from the OCAT slides. While mainland texts feature servers and entertainers, as mentioned previously, OCAT slideshows consistently suggest that Okinawans are being controlled by crafty politicians. The 2012-2016 script frames its discussion of Okinawa-US relations and the base issue with the line, quote, "The politics of Okinawa use the base issue for leverage on a number of issues locally and nationally." The lecture then accuses Okinawan prefectural government of regularly employing the historical and social realities of US bases, referred to in one slide as the guilt factor, to extract subsidies and favorable policy decisions from the national government. Even pro-US politicians are said to, quote, "adopt the agenda of the anti-base forces when it serves their political interests." Parallel to the opportunistic politicization lamented in the lectures are numerous references to the Okinawan media as a biased, dishonest, and propagandist force that riles up the common people, thus creating the very conditions whereby politicians can use the base issue for a political boost. For this reason, the local media is labeled as antagonistic to the Marines, and the 2014 OCAT goes so far as to say that all local media, quote, "undermines our presence and the alliance." Anti-base activists are shown as a similarly domineering force. They're depicted together with the local media as a vocal minority, in two instances in the 2012-2016 slides, as an emoji of an angry yellow face screaming into a megaphone in order to manipulate the otherwise supportive majority. The slideshows make it clear that the politicians, media, and activists are only successful in their anti-base schemes because they are working with a pliant and capricious public. The people of Okinawa are described in the 2012-2016 OCAT as a silent majority of yellow emoji faces who, quote, "do not usually go out of their way to find information," and have a, quote, "self-serving approach to news issues." This representation of most Okinawans as well-meaning but easily manipulated echoes the way that the term Gaijin power locates responsibility for poor base host community relations with an Okinawan and Japanese culture of passivity. Meanwhile, surrounded by power-hungry politicians, propagandistic media, and a sheep-like public, the Marines emerge in the OCATs as unsung heroes. The 2012-2016 OCAT, for example, suggests that all of the problems identified by the anti-base movement have already been solved through the hard work of Marines and of the two governments, though the Okinawan people have not yet realized it. As we have seen, the sense of Gaijin power that Marine orientations have identified as a cause of military crime in Japan and Okinawa can be described as a logical outcome of base personnel accepting the OCAT's and welcome text's depiction of a passive native population and of their own special place as heroes on an exotic vacation. Though more work is clearly needed to gauge how defense personnel and their families receive these texts, it is clear that the messages they transmitted under the auspices of cultural education contained more than just a general sense of American military exceptionalism, though that is indeed present. There are, in fact, more practical applications. Cynthia Enlow has argued that wives and families have been militarized to create supportive base environments in which soldiers can more comfortably do their jobs. Here we see that even whole foreign cultures can be militarized through their repackaging in ways that minimize anxiety about living abroad and circumvent questions about why the US military should have bases outside its borders to begin with. In portraying Okinawa and Japan as beautiful, highly consumable destinations where Americans can easily access exotic culture, these welcome texts attempt to assuage fears over culture shock and language barriers, and instead depict a lifestyle free of challenging encounters with uncomprehending and/or incomprehensible locals. This reassures not only Marines who feel nervous about living abroad, but also spouses who need convincing to accompany Marines on deployment. In both cases, contributing to Marines' greater capacity to fulfill their duties. Furthermore, by dismissing Okinawan anti-base sentiment as an unfortunate side effect of local political power plays, welcome texts suggest that the Marines are welcome in Japan and would be welcome in Okinawa if only the locals had their facts straight. If the Marines imagine themselves to be a wanted presence, then questions that could hamper military functionality, such as why US bases exist in Japan and Okinawa in the first place, become less pertinent. This is perhaps the true Gaijin power of the United States Marine Corps in Japan, the ability not just to ignore rules and customs, but to ignore inconvenient questions, or even, where necessary, entire populations.